All right, tonight we've got Tom Shroder here. He's an award-winning journalist. He's been editing and writing for nearly 40 years. He's got a new book coming out, The Most Famous Writer Who Ever Lived. We'll probably get into that, but definitely Darren and I want to talk to him about a couple of his previous works. One is The Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal, and then an older book called Old Souls, Compelling Evidence from Children Who Remember Past Lives. And he's also been independent editor and editor to Washington Post magazine. Lots of good stuff. I'm not going to get into the whole bio here. I'd be here for like a half hour. So
also too boring. So.
No, it's good stuff, man. It's really good to have you here. Thanks for coming on the show, Tom.
Sure, I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
How are you? Doing pretty good?
Yeah. I was just watching some baseball.
Oh, nice.
Go Blue Jays.
Yeah, right. No, I live in the DC area, so I'm a Nats fan.
Oh, I see.
DC in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, boy. Big time.
So I guess the book of yours that, of course, stuck out to me right from the beginning is, and I can't remember, I swear I was trying to track you down a couple of years ago, but I wasn't as good at getting in touch with people back then. Is the past lives one, which is, and the reason is because I've got my oldest daughter, when she doesn't do it as much now, but when she was, on the 2 to 3 range, when she had kind of first really learned to articulate herself, she was constantly, talking about, when she used to be my grandma, way back in a couple lifetimes, or she was my mom at one time, she was my grandma at one time, I think we were brother and sister at one time, and then I was kind of reading some stuff on soul entanglement at the time, on how these kind of, these souls, the one look on it is that these souls kind of, reincarnate in different social structures and things like that, so, it seems to be a hard subject to find people to talk about these days.
Yeah, well, had you seen Old Souls at that point?
No, I hadn't. No, I found that one now when I started looking for more information on it.
Well, because if you've read it now, that's exactly the pattern that these cases follow. And just to give you a little background, and just to catch your listeners up on what Old Souls was about is that I discovered that the former head of the psychiatry at the University of Virginia was a man named Ian Stevenson.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about his work.
And in the 60s, he became intrigued when he read widely, and not just in psychiatry, but he noticed that he was interested in sort of paranormal type phenomenon, and he was reading, and he realized that around the world there were reports of cases where children, very small children, began to talk about things that sounded like a previous life. And he wrote an essay saying that it would be interesting for a qualified scientist to sort of investigate these cases and to sort of try to determine if there was any evidence that that these people really had previous lives. And so the Society for Psychical Research sort of contacted him and said, "We think that's a great idea. Why don't you do it?" And, here he was, the head of the, Department of Psychiatry at a major university. So, but he decided he was going to do it. And he ended up spending 30 years chasing down thousands of these cases around the world. And in some of them, he actually found evidence that these small children gave details about the lives of people who appeared to be complete strangers to them, who had died before they were born. And that and they gave enough details so that you could determine who the previous person was, that they gave names, they gave locations, names of towns and things like that. And that in some cases, these turned out to be accurate details about people who for as far as he could figure out, these children had never met, and nobody in their family had ever met them. So that was, it took me like 2 years, because he was shy of publicity, because his goal was to get mainstream scientists to be interested in this. And he didn't want to be dismissed as some kind of flake.
Yeah.
So he thought that publicity and sort of journalists writing about it would only make his scientific colleagues more skeptical. So he was really resistant, but over a couple of years, I persuaded him to trust me, and I went on 2-month-long research trips with him where he was revisiting cases that he'd studied in the past and also looking for some new ones.
Huh. Really interesting. So why were you so open to this? Like, you come from a fairly mainstream background in journalism. Like, there's a lot of people that would just ignore this kind of stuff or ridicule it. I mean, you seem pretty, I don't know, just rational and open to this kind of research.
Because I had done a story about another psychiatrist called Brian Weiss. This is at the time I was the editor of the Sunday magazine in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And he was at Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami, and he had hypnotized some of his patients and regressed them to what he believed were authentic past lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, in journalism, it's always the unexpected things that sort of get the most attention. And so here you have a respected psychiatrist who was espousing this far out stuff. So that combination intrigued me as a journalist. I thought, well, that's, there's a lot of interest in that. So I went and I interviewed him, and, I thought that these cases of hypnotic regression, ultimately I thought that they had, no persuasive evidence that these were real, because the whole nature of hypnosis is that you tell people to relax, you tell them to imagine things, and you sort of get in touch with their subconscious maybe, but there was no details in the accounts that these persons gave under hypnosis that you couldn't have learned from reading historical romance novels or from knowing a little history. In other words, there wasn't anything that anybody couldn't have known. And these were adults he was regressing to. So they had a lifetime of experience. So there was nothing very convincing about them. I did a past life hypnotic regression too.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was just making the stuff up. I mean, I was relaxed and it was sort of like daydreaming.
It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't have any sense that this was real.
Yeah.
And so, and like I said, none of his cases had people revealing details that were specific to one person and that nobody else could have known. And yet, in my research for this, I came across Stevenson's work, and he was the guy I was interviewing, had become a best-selling author writing books about this stuff. And meanwhile, Stevenson was very little known and obscure.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I read his case stories, and first of all, he wasn't dealing with hypnosis. He was dealing with spontaneous statements by children, just like your child, exactly like your child, in fact. And he was very carefully going and trying to rule out any ways that the kid could have known some of the details that they revealed. And of course, he was checking them for cases where the details the child spoke later turned out to be true about a real dead person. So I thought, why am I writing about this guy who's basically talking a lot of hooey as far as I was concerned, when there's this other guy who's got some really compelling evidence, and I don't know how to explain it, but I sure would like to know more. So that's how I got into it.
Did that change your view quite a bit about it? Like, obviously your soul.
Well, I went in, I thought when I basically wrote a proposal based on that. I sold the book idea.
Yeah.
And I was about to get on a plane to meet him in Paris. We could both go to Beirut, Lebanon together to begin the thing. And I remember sitting in the waiting lounge in Paris before I had met him. And I was just thinking, the worst thing in the world could happen would be if this guy turned out to be a complete flake, and there was obviously nothing to these cases, because what would I write about? But instead, the opposite turned out to be true. These cases were even more compelling than I had thought. And, to talk to these people and see and meet the families and talk to them, you realize that they had nothing to gain by this. They had no interest in becoming celebrities or anything like that. And in fact, in their communities, it wasn't a big deal. They weren't getting anything out of this. They weren't getting any money. And in some cases, in fact, the families really wanted to suppress it. They didn't want to talk about it because either it embarrassed them or it made them feel like their kids were, not loyal to them. And there was a lot of emotional upset about it, and they didn't want to talk about it. It wasn't like they were going for publicity or anything. And yet some of their story, and yet they didn't deny that. For instance, there was one case where a little girl, as soon as she could talk, began to take the phone off the hook in the family's home and dial the number and start shouting into it names. And later when she began to talk better, she'd say, well, that's the name of my daughter. That's the name of my husband. I need to talk to them. And so eventually she gave the name of like 7. What she said was her husband's name and 7 children's name. And she said this town where they lived, which was a few hundred miles away. And so the family was really curious about this, as you could imagine. And so they met somebody from that town that she had been talking about, and they started telling this person all the names their daughter had been giving. And this person said, oh my God, there really is a family with all those names. And the mother of the family died in heart surgery just before your daughter was born.
Wow.
Like a few months before your daughter was born. So that got back to the family of the, Stevenson called it the previous personality. That's the name of, the dead person who matched up to this. And her daughters paid a surprise visit to the house. And the daughters told me that when they walked in, the little girl instantly called them by name and said, the first thing she said was, did your parents give you the jewelry that I wanted you to have? And this sealed it for them, because they knew, and nobody else outside the family knew, that when their mother was dying, she told her uncles that, her brothers rather, that she wanted these girls, her daughters, to have certain specific jewelry of hers.
Wow.
So they, and then since they were a wealthier family than the little girl's family, their family was afraid that the little girl was going to try to get money from them by claiming to be the dead wife of this man. And so they wanted to suppress the whole thing. Plus they did business with people who would have not liked the idea of reincarnation.
Yeah.
So they really actively tried to suppress it. So when we went to talk to them, they didn't want to talk, but the daughters finally came out and said, I can't deny that what this little girl said was true. And she knew things only our mother could have known.
I was actually wondering, does it tend to be that it's it's lineal like that in most cases, or does it jump around? Like, do you have cases
what do you
where
mean
it was
by
like,
lineal?
well, that one kind of worked out that it was,
Like a
you know,
recent
the
death?
birth was kind of right the next step. Is there more cases where it was, you know, say a few hundred years ago, or any historical cases?
That's the really interesting thing, is that the children who he could determine who they were talking about, you know, sometimes kids, like in your case, the child would say something general, you know, and either it was in the same family or maybe it was about somebody they never could identify. So they didn't know who that person was the child was talking about. But in all the cases where you could determine who the child was talking about, they were people who had died in the recent past, in the previous generation.
I wonder how, if it fades and things. I mean, it opens up so many different cans of worms. You know, does it fade over time? Can you only remember the last one?
That was the other thing, was in almost all these cases, the child was sometimes even obsessed with the memories that they were having from the time they could talk, and usually it began to fade around 6 or 7 years old. You know, about the time that children start to socialize more, that was really when it started to fade, when they were getting out of the house, and eventually they would forget about these things altogether and stop talking about them at all. But in cases where enough information was given so that a connection could be made to the previous personality's families, sometimes the previous families accepted the child's claims and developed lifelong relationships with them.
Wow.
And actually sort of acted almost like a second family.
Yeah.
That's crazy. You wonder if, you know, if there's any blood there somehow. You know, when you hear these, I can't remember what
You mean blood relation?
Yeah. Like, I can't remember where I was reading it, but it was that idea that there's these, you know, that, you know, it's always, you know, whether it's a group of 50 or 100, and it's like pre-planned in the afterlife, they're all planning it out, and then you just don't get to remember it. It's like a ride.
Well,
it's like
I mean,
there
were many cases where people remembered the lives of, or talked about what seemed like the lives of their relatives, you know, like a grandparent or something, or even like an uncle or an aunt, or those situations. But those, in terms of sort of proving that this was real and not some kind of fantasy on the child's part, that was problematic, because when a child gave information about a grandparent, there were lots of sources of information they could have gotten that from, you know, sort of like photo albums. Their parents might not have remembered talking about details of the grandparent's life, but
they could have. Yeah.
But who could say that they never mentioned it?
Yeah.
You know, so yes, there were a lot of those cases, but he tended not to spend as much time on those for that reason. And he was more interested in cases where children were talking about people who the family had obviously had no contact with and no knowledge of.
Yeah. It's so interesting.
Only because that was more compelling, not because those other family cases weren't possibly exactly the same, but just because you couldn't rule out that the child was saying this stuff because they had heard it or seen it somewhere in their family's albums.
Did it pretty much sell you on reincarnation doing your research?
Well, but what I realized, what I came to believe was that this wasn't the result of fraud or delusion, and that some of these things that there seemed to be no known explanation for. But to say, oh, well, it's explained by reincarnation, that didn't really help too much, because what's reincarnation? These were fragmentary memories. There was a lot of stuff that these kids didn't remember or didn't know. And how exactly, and there's also, when you're talking about science, you want to have a theory for how things work based on the evidence, okay? So what's the theory? How would these memories pass from a dead person to a child who was born after that person died. And nobody had, and there's no evidence for any mechanism by which this could happen.
Well, they're all out there for sure. I mean, there's also the idea that maybe it's non-locality consciousness, and it's just sort of out there in the ether.
Right, exactly. It's kind of like radio waves that somehow they tuned into for a reason. So I, to me, ultimately, where I came down was it to me a really brilliant demonstration that we know far less about how the world works than we pretend we do, or than we think we do, and that this was, to me, a huge indication that there's, that Shakespeare quote is, "There's more in heaven and earth than is dreamed of in our philosophy," from Hamlet. Well, that's the quote I started the book with. And it really underlined for me that, and I think if you look at the state of modern science, physics, and cosmology, what you get is stuff that is far weirder than reincarnation that the physicists are talking about, like multiple universes and the whole quantum reality is, something that doesn't fit into our common sense view of the world either. Like that electrons are really neither here nor there, but they're this kind of potential position everywhere, and it only takes a real position when you measure it. And it's like, it's not like you don't know where it is. It's like it isn't anywhere, and it's everywhere at the same time. Yeah. I mean, all that weird stuff that happens in quantum physics, I think it just shows us that the ultimate nature of reality is far more elusive and mysterious than a lot of people realize or think.
Or it's just a simulation, just trying to come up with shit the deeper we look. It's like, holy fuck, what do I do now? Okay, well, here you go. Figure that out.
So you've read about the whole simulation theory, like that we're all in some kind of computer simulation. And then they present, mathematical evidence that that's not as unlikely as it seems.
No,
so who knows?
The math says it's almost more likely than it's not, I think.
That's right.
Which I kind of have trouble with. I think you can kind of prove anything with math to an extent. But, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to argue with. It's hard to argue with for sure. Especially when you see what we're doing, in 100 years. What we can do with the shit we've got. Like, to think that if someone had 500 years, like if we can go 500 years without blowing ourselves up, who knows what we'll be able to do.
What about 500,000 years
let's start with 500.
Yeah. Right. No, it's really, and also there's other strange stuff that happens, sort of some of these synchronicity moments that seem like, they're almost like scripted or something,
Oh, yeah.
I was listening to, it's Dr. Wargo today, because we're having him on later, about his take on synchronicity is that it's more of a non-linear time thing. It's like...
It's more of a precognition.
It's more of a precog. It's like you're noticing that because it's some little
emotional
moment
residue
that's playing out from some future reward that you're going to get. It's pretty wild stuff. I was going to ask, did you have a favorite case that comes to mind from the book?
Well, I really like the case of the little girl because one of the things, because she had that dramatic thing where the daughters walked in, now grown up, and she instantly recognized them and asked them about the jewelry. But also because when she was little, she was obsessed with the dead woman's husband, who she thought was her husband. And she would call him on the phone, all the time as a little girl. And he kind of believed that she really was his former wife. So he didn't want to stop talking to her. But then eventually he did. And when we went to visit them years later, he said, I asked him why he stopped talking to her, if she stopped calling, and said, I had to tell her to stop because not because I didn't want to talk to her, but for her sake, because he felt that she was sort of clinging to that past life memory, and it was preventing her from having a normal childhood and from growing up and falling in love with somebody else. And so very selflessly, he tried to cut it off. And then I said, well, so then you've never heard from her again? And then he very sheepishly said, well, I talked to her like a month ago. And the daughters were horrified to hear this. But that she was still, and at this time, the little girl was now 20 years old, a very nice young woman who taught English in Beirut. And she still seemed haunted by it, and she had never married, never really had a serious boyfriend. And I asked her, well, does this have to do with your attachment to the previous life? And she just, sort of shook her head. Yes. She really choked up.
Wow.
So that was a very moving case. And there were a lot of other interesting cases. I mean, in one case in India, in a farming village, there was a young woman who sort of fell into a trance, and they thought she was dead. And, so it was like, and she seemed to be dead for like 5 or 6 minutes. And then when she revived, she began saying, who are these people? And I don't live in this village. And she said she lived in the city, and her language and her ability to write were sort of much more sophisticated than this rural woman who who had passed out and they thought she had died. And so she began telling the story about how that she had lived in the city and that who her father was, and that she had married into this family, and the in-laws hated her and they ended up like hitting her in the head with a brick. And it turned out that there really was a case of a woman who had gone to live with her new in-laws and who had wound up dead after being hit in the head with a brick.
Wow.
And so the father of the dead woman came to the village, had heard about this, and he came to the village, and she recognized him and all that other kind of stuff, where she said stuff that only his daughter could have known, according to him anyway. So that was a really cool case, because it wasn't even about, a child. It was about a woman who sort of woke up in the middle of her life and started talking about somebody else's life. Wow. So that was just very cool.
Yeah, I was going to say how that normally doesn't happen. Like, it's interesting how as adults we need to be regressed to have some sort of vision of our past lives. I mean, I've been through that as well, where I go through a past life regression, and I'm somewhere and I see something, but I can't help but think it's just my imagination making something up. But then I'm like, well, then where is this coming from? And maybe it really is a past life. And I'm kind of doing that dance between, am I just making this up, or is there something really there? But yet these kids, as like you said, up to 6 or 7, are still open, or they're just not bombarded with the crap that we have now, that there's still, there's still something there. It's like easier for them. And
also, they're not unsure about it. I mean, they are absolutely positive. I mean, they don't even, at that age, at that young age, and even younger than 7, like at 3 and 4,
yeah,
they just blurt it out. Just, like there was an American case where this kid started like drawing pictures of World War II planes and started talking about saying, that he flew a plane like that it got shot down, all this other detailed stuff. And so they take this picture and look at a book of World War II aircraft, and some really obscure plane in there looked exactly like the picture that he drew. And he gave a lot of other details that a little kid really wouldn't have known obscure details about the history of, this kind of plane. And so, it's really, people who want to dismiss this, if you take a careful look at these cases, it's extremely hard to dismiss it. It's like they seem to be tuning into something.
Yeah, and yet it's ignored by the mainstream. You've got all these other theories out there that we're talking about that, whether it's like some of the quantum stuff or like multi-universe theories, which are still just theories, even dark energy and dark matter, yet you talk about the stuff where there actually is some evidence to look at that at least deserves some more investigation or some acknowledgement.
Yeah, I would think so. I think one of the hard things is it's sort of hard to think of what the next step in this research is, because you can keep accumulating these cases. There are plenty around, but there's always some doubt about, sometimes the details aren't absolutely perfect. They're close or something, but they're not right on, or sometimes there's some extra details that are just flat out wrong. And
then what do you do with those? Yeah.
And how do you go further? Well, one thing that they did was they do psychological tests, they do intelligence testing, they do testing to see if there's any mental illness in kids who are doing that. And the answer is no, that the kids are completely normal. Sometimes they're slightly more intelligent than the average kid. But, who knows if that's just a small sample size or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to think, how do you take this research to the next step? And the real thing that's missing is, as I said, any idea for what, the mechanism is by which these things could be transferred from one individual to another. And, if it has to do with, the fact that we're all like in a computer simulation or something, we're nowhere near sort of nailing that down. So, what's the next step? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It is a tough one. I guess you just throw it in that, there probably is something going on in the afterlife bucket.
In that ignore bucket for a bit. Darren, how old was your daughter when she stopped doing that? Like 5 or 6 or something?
She stopped about a year ago. And she's smarter than she should be.
How old is she now?
She's 5.
Oh, okay. Oh, she's only 5.
Did she ever say any names or anything?
No, she never said any names.
So
what were the statements that she made?
It was always her being, I'd be doing something, whether it be reading her story or rubbing her back or doing something with her, teaching her something, and she'd be like, "Oh yeah, I remember teaching you how to do this when I was your grandma." And it was just like, huh. Then what do you say to that? You just sort of take it in passing.
Oh well, who she was talking about then, though. I guess you had 2 grandmas. Did she ever?
Well, that's the thing is, yeah, I had always thought of it as being way farther back than that. I never even considered to look into the recent, because she's done my mother said she was my mom before and my grandma, and my mom is still around. But I mean, I'm not ruling out that both happened for sure. And
yeah, well, see, that's the sort of thing, though. You're hitting on it. You're hitting on exactly the sort of thing that comes up is that, okay, your mom's still alive, so that's obviously wrong, right? And then you think, well, maybe, grandma, mama, maybe it just felt the same. But who knows? I mean, that stuff gets weird.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess for me, I didn't really need to prove it, because it's definitely not something that, I was so against that I needed to get to the bottom of it. For me, it's just like, oh, cool, kind of like when I see my UFO, it's just like, huh, there's a UFO.
Well,
that's what everybody's talking about.
When my son was little, he used to say, when I was a daddy, and I dealt with it like a grammar problem, No, it's like when you're going to be a daddy. He goes, no, when I was a daddy. And I just didn't really explore that.
I guess that's how it was for me too. But I knew it was weird at the time. I didn't look at it as a grammatical. I took it as like a past sort of thing. But to me, it wasn't, it wasn't like a game changer. It was just like, huh?
Yeah. Right.
I heard about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can imagine, though, if he had started giving specific names and
then I would have been probably pretty floored. I would have been like, so I would have grabbed a pen. And I remember, too, there was times that I kind of pressed her because I knew there was the possibility of something being there, but she could never really, it was hard. She wasn't obsessed with it for sure because, she didn't want to keep going. She was on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So what's next? What's this new book about, Tom?
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of like talking about being
relatives,
being your grandma. About being relative. My grandfather was a writer too, and he was named McKinley Cantor, and in 1956 he won a Pulitzer Prize for literature for the novel Andersonville, which was about a Civil War prison camp where thousands of Union soldiers died in terrible conditions.
Wow.
And, he's a very larger than life character and very interesting. And I knew him well. He lived on Siesta Key in Sarasota, Florida. And I would, from the time I was a baby, my parents would bring us down for like Christmas vacation, and we'd stay at their house. And then when I was 14, we moved to Sarasota, like a mile from their house on the beach. And so I knew him quite well. He died when I was 23, like 3 days after my first daughter was born. And, and I became a writer, and I'd never, even for a second, considered that maybe he influenced me, oddly. I mean, it just never occurred to me. And in fact, by the time I was in my 20s, he had fame and fortune in the 50s and early 60s, but he didn't invest the money, and he kept spending like it was rolling in when it wasn't rolling in anymore. And literary tastes change, and he sort of stopped being in favor, and ultimately he's very little remembered now. I mean, it wasn't like Hemingway, who became a household name and stayed that way. He was legitimately a celebrity at one point, but then, by the 70s, he was almost completely forgotten. And he sort of died broke and disappointed. And, and so it wasn't until I was really in my 50s that I began to sort of wonder about that, about, why I always had my brother and sister and I would always sort of have this attitude that he was overblown, that he was kind of a little bit pompous and thought he was way more famous than he was. And so we didn't really take him seriously, even though he had accomplished this amazing thing. But then when I got in my 50s, I started thinking about him more and more. And just as really, it was just when my mother died that I began really having questions about him and realizing that there was nobody alive on the planet who could answer those questions anymore. Uh-huh. And I think a lot of people get to, the age in their 50s or something when their parents are beginning to get ill or die, that they realize that they're suddenly disconnected from their past and all the stuff that they maybe didn't want to pay attention to when they were young, that they really get curious about. And just at the time where there's nobody to ask. But then I remembered something, that when my grandfather used to write, he and my grandmother would go on these great trips to Europe and stuff, and they'd write these fabulous letters to me. But we always joked that he wasn't really writing the letters to us. He was writing it to the Library of Congress, because after he won the Pulitzer, the Library of Congress said they wanted to collect all his letters and papers. And so he was constantly sending stuff off to the Library of Congress. And I hadn't thought about that in 30 years. And I realized that, I live in the DC area, as I said, and the Library of Congress is just at the end of the metro line that I live on. So how ironic, I thought, that just as I was thinking there was no source of understanding, I realized that he'd left all his papers to the Library of Congress, and in fact, there turned out to be 50,000 documents in storage in the library. So I spent basically a year or 18 months going through all this stuff and sort of following the leads where they led. And it sort of, at the end, I had this unbelievable sort of novel-like story about my grandfather's amazing life and sort of how it affected me. So that was called, I called it the most famous writer who ever lived, because my mom always used to tell us that when she and my uncle were little, that my grandfather had them convinced that he was the most famous writer who ever lived. And, that the theme of sort of attaining, wanting fame and success and being able to attain it and then have it all sort of wash away and to sort of die broke and bitter, that was really interesting to me, because, it's something we all like strive for. And in the end, what is it worth? So I found out all sorts of amazing and surprising things about him that I didn't know.
Wow, that's super interesting. I wonder, did you ever hear of anything from your daughter? Like, your daughter was born 3 days after he passed away. It's interesting. We're just talking about all the past life stuff.
No, she never.
I almost thought that's where you were going.
Did she become a writer?
She's a great writer. Well, and not only that, but his mother, my great grandmother, was the first woman newspaper editor in Iowa history. And my mother wrote a novel. And now my daughter is a really talented writer as well. So, wow. The genetics of it is kind of interesting.
Yeah. What was the thing that surprised you most of all the stuff that you read? Like, realizing there's a whole other side to his life that you may not have known.
One thing that surprised me was, I had always thought that he and my grandmother, who married when they were in their early 20s, had like the sort of storybook romance up until the end anyway. But, that he always would say how, sort of she was magically preserved by some, that she had found some stream in the mountains of Peru that kept her forever young and that kind of stuff, And they seemed very attached, but it turned out that he had like dozens of affairs, including some serious ones. And I found letters to that effect that really were shocking to me. And the other amazing thing was that his father, who I knew he hated his father, but I didn't know that much about him. But his father turned out to be this amazing con man who actually ended up spending some time in Sing Sing, but was, part of the corrupt political regimes in Chicago and Montreal, and had all, and I found a 1934 article in the New Yorker describing this charismatic guy who had a pyramid scheme going. And that was my great grandfather.
No way. Holy shit.
Yeah.
Pyramid schemes back in the day were probably easy.
Well, people were very credulous, and he could get in trouble, multiple times and then go somewhere else. And there wasn't like the internet.
That's right.
So he would start all over and do the same sort of crap all over again. He kept popping up in all these famous scandals.
Just like old man Rockefeller.
Yeah. So that was kind of amazing. And also, it's the very sort of moving stuff about, I didn't realize that my he had a drinking problem. But then I found all these letters he wrote about how, he didn't feel like he could write when he wasn't drinking.
Yeah.
So that was really very sad.
Yeah. It's funny how, the great writers and the movie stars and the rock stars and the musicians and the really creative people always seem to have those vices.
Well, that's what he felt like, that he couldn't, that if he didn't have that to look forward to at the end of a day, sort of ripping his guts out at the typewriter, he just couldn't keep the creative juices flowing. But he ended up flat on his back, at the, in somebody's yard in the middle of Iowa, and had to call my uncle to come pick him up because he had the delirium tremens, so it didn't end in a very good place. And he ended up dying of congestive heart failure, which is a result of long-term alcoholism.
Yeah.
And then, when did that book come out?
That came out in October.
And then in between, you have the book on psychedelics. How did you fall into that one?
Oh, well, basically, I had some psychedelic experiences when I was in college, and they really impressed me as being non-trivial. That I really felt like I had some insights at that point that basically I used my whole life, and that sort of helped me sort of be a better person. And so I was always aware of that. And then, this is a weird story, because when I was in college, I was the editor of the college newspaper, and I was home for spring break in Sarasota when I was like 21 years old. And there was like an article in the local paper about this hippie who was building this fabulous house in the woods by himself. And so I decided, hey, that might be, and he was my age. So I decided, hey, that might be an interesting story, for my college paper. So I went out and found this guy, and he was a really interesting guy, and he had all these wild philosophical things to say. And so then, so I wrote the story. He had a pet wolf that was, out on a chain in the yard while he was building this house. And 10 years later, when I had become editor of the Miami magazine, I saw a story in the Tampa paper about this wild sort of perpetual college dropout, who was saying that ecstasy was was going to solve people's psychiatric problems. And so I sent a reporter to do a story on this guy, called him a Tim Leary for the 80s. And then 15 years after that, I was the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And, I'm leaving out the most important part. This guy was the same guy who was building that house that I had interviewed back when I was in college. I recognized the name. And so then 15 years after that, when I was at the Washington Post, the New York Times ran a story about how Harvard was doing the first study of psychedelic therapy used to treat people for psychiatric problems, in this case, depression for people with terminal cancer. And the institute, and there was a nonprofit institute behind it, funding it. And the head of that institute, the same guy. So that I said, okay, that's it. I'm doing and that combined with my sense that this really was a valuable thing, potentially, said, now I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write this myself. And I wrote a magazine article about it. And then when they started treating combat veterans who had gotten PTSD in Iraq and Afghanistan, I thought, this really ought to be a book.
And our listeners will know who that is.
Excuse me?
I think our listeners will know who that is too, that guy.
Oh, Rick Doblin?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've had Brad Burge on the show a couple of times.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
So anyway, I met Rick when I was 21 years old just because I happened to be in the same town and I heard that he was building this weird house in the woods.
With a pet wolf.
and then I kept running into him. And when I called him after I heard about the Harvard study, not only did he remember me, but he had said just that day he had shown both those stories to his board of directors as a kind of indication about how far he'd come in his image, in improving his image from, those days to now when he was doing a study with Harvard.
I'd call that a synchronicity, really.
Yeah, well, it sure felt like it to me.
Or a future reward.
And he was doing a study with a psychiatrist in Charleston, South Carolina. That was where he was testing the use of MDMA, which is ecstasy, in therapy with women who mostly had PTSD as a result of rape or sexual abuse. And over the years, that grew to include combat veterans. Yeah. And so I sort of found one of those people who had been treated, one of the combat veterans who had this horrific experience in Iraq and had PTSD that the VA couldn't do anything to help. And he was on the brink of committing suicide when he found out about that they were doing these studies in Charleston, and he lived just in a town just north of Charleston. So he got into the study and it basically cured him. So I have three characters in the book that I focus on. I tried to write it kind of like a movie, where, you see the guy in Iraq, and then you also see Rick as a wild kid in New College in Sarasota doing acid every day. And then you see the psychiatrist, Michael Mithofer, his name is, also in college, sort of having an experience with LSD that scared him but intrigued him. And then you kind of follow each of these from their beginnings through until they all connect together in these trials that basically save the combat veterans' life.
Wow. So there's also a darker side to that, the history of the MDMA trials, because there's a lot of good research going on and good news, just like there is with psychedelics and addiction treatment and stuff like that nowadays. There's a lot of positives to it, but unfortunately there was a stumble along the way with part of the trials. When they went to some sort of scientific panel, there was the wrong drug was used or something. And you want to talk, because that was that just shows
amazing. Because it took them. A lot of this book is about how difficult it became to do any research at all. Because what I didn't realize was that ever since LSD was discovered in 1947 accidentally, and Sandoz, the laboratory that Albert Hofmann worked for, sent LSD out to labs and to universities around the world and said, this is a amazingly powerful drug with novel effects. We want you guys to experiment with it and see what it's good for.
Oh, yeah, good. Yeah, we're going to hear about this. Yeah.
Well, very quickly, a lot of people figured out, hey, this is a sort of transformative drug. It can, and they started using it in conjunction with therapy with people with major psychiatric illnesses, and it had tremendous benefit, and it was having huge success. And I think between like 1950 and the mid 60s, like somebody did a survey of 40,000 patients that had been given this treatment and determined that it had a hugely better success rate than any other form of psychotherapy. And not only that, but that given under controlled conditions with medical supervision, that it was, considering how powerful its effects were, it was remarkably safe. So that was the state in the mid 60s where psychiatry was being revolutionized by these psychedelic drugs. And everybody just thought that the sky was the limit and how useful they were going to be. But at the same time, the CIA was like secretly investigating it, for use as everything from an interrogation drug to a drug that they could give to their agents so that if they got caught, they could take the drug and be useless in interrogations, or maybe even, to put it in the water supply so that an enemy army would be completely disoriented. Anyway, they all sorts of wild stuff that they were thinking of using it for. And so they had things like we're running a whorehouse in San Francisco. And when the Johns came in, they would dose them unsuspectingly with LSD just to see what effect it had when somebody just sort of slipped it in their drink. Doing really irresponsible, horrible stuff that had some really bad consequences. But as a result of that, they were, sort of loosely spreading LSD around and in these studies that they were doing. And so there were a lot of people who sort of got a hold of it. And, it's a very unforgettable experience. So it's got out. The CIA kind of single-handedly created a black market of this drug. And it just caught on, and people started synthesizing it. And you get the whole phenomenon of the acid tests, which, the book is named after, in California with Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead playing at these giant parties where everybody was taking LSD. And it started, being taken all over college campuses. And basically it scared the shit out of the establishment. And there began to be all these really sort of overblown scare stories and all, newspapers and magazines about people who thought they were Superman and jumped off buildings, or they took LSD and they started like indiscriminately attacking and raping people and things like that, most of which were not sourced. Most of it was hysterical. Most of it was not true. And so they, made it they put it on the Schedule I and made it a highly illegal drug, which of course did very little to shut down the illicit use of the drug, but it completely shut down the
scientific studies,
all research.
Yeah.
And Rick, who was a nobody, sort of inserted himself into the community of serious psychedelic researchers and basically spearheaded this 30-year effort against huge odds and prejudices to get it seriously studied again.
And when was that? What year was that then when it got put on the schedule?
1970. They put it on schedule.
Yeah. Huh.
That's mass.
So anyway, I have like just a few minutes left. If you have any other question.
Yeah, no, we're pretty close. I was just curious about the MDMA. I think the thing about the MDMA would be very interesting, just to finish that sort of part off. So
sure.
There was studies on that, and then when they went into the lab, the kind of
right.
Yeah.
Well, so I was going to say. So anyway, Rick and Michael Mithoefer were in the middle of this. At the end, after about 30 years of trying, they were finally in the stages where they were going to get FDA approval for these studies. And they were trying to get a university to back them on it. And they were about to do that when this government-funded scientist, who was basically paid by the government to find the negative consequences of these drugs. That's what the government was looking for. They weren't looking to study it. They were looking to find reasons to fear it. And so as Rick and Michael were in the middle of getting all these approvals, he came out with a study that says MDMA is way more toxic than we realized. I was giving it to monkeys, and so many of them died that I shut down the research project. So he was saying this is like, not only dangerous, but fatal. And that shut everything down. And then a year later, it turned out that the drugs that he'd been giving these monkeys, the drug that killed him, was mislabeled. It was not MDMA, it was methamphetamine. And he had to do this retraction. And of course, the ironic thing was that methamphetamine, even though it had such negative reaction, was already a prescribed drug. You could get methamphetamine with a prescription, whereas these drugs that were far less harmful, many times less harmful, were still, absolutely prohibited. So anyway, when that happened, they finally were able to start the research that is now at the point where it's been through phase 1 and phase 2. The way these things work is drugs have to go through 3 phases of research, each one more elaborate and more expensive than the last, before it can be approved for medical use. And they're now on the 3rd and final phase, which they estimate will last from 3 to 5 years. At which point, if their results are as good as they have been up until now, it will become a therapy that a psychiatrist can prescribe to his patients.
Yeah, hopefully. And then in the meantime, all this legal over the, prescription stuff is the dangerous stuff that people are dying from, and all the helpful stuff is
opiates and stuff. Yeah, and in fact, one of the really promising uses of psychedelic treatment is to help people who have opioid addictions, which of course is the huge epidemic that's like crushing America right now.
Canada too.
Yeah.
Canada too. Well, even psilocybin seems to be starting to poke its head into the ring with depression treatment. And
they're using psilocybin for all this stuff. Yeah. Including addiction treatment, even and MDMA. They're even doing a trial where to help autistic adults improve their ability to socially interact.
Wow!
And it was psilocybin was phenomenally successful in helping people quit smoking.
Ooh, I wonder if that had something to do with my quitting smoking.
Maybe.
Yeah, good. A lot of people who sort of have a positive psilocybin experience, sometimes they just feel like their attitude about how they treat their body just changes on a dime.
Yeah.
What they eat, whether they smoke or not.
Yeah. We've had listeners send in stories of exactly that. Like they have. Well,
I do still to this day, at least once a year.
Yeah.
A good wrestle with my subconscious.
Right. Well, and ultimately there are a lot of people who say, well, why should we have to wait until we have a psychiatric illness, mental illness, before we get to experience this? Because it's useful for people in their everyday life.
Maintenance.
Yeah.
So,
I as I said, I had some sort of insights that I used almost every day for the past 40 years.
I agree 100%. Before we let you go, real quick, where can our listeners go to get more Tom Shroder?
Oh, well, I have a website, tomshroder.com, with that sort of has all my books listed. And, you also might be interested. I just Ghost wrote a book that just came out.
That's what I meant to ask you about. Yeah,
called The Operator.
Yeah,
and it's I wrote it for the guy who killed Osama bin Laden, the SEAL Team 6 member who put 3 bullets in Osama's head, and it's all about his like 14-year career as a Navy SEAL and the 400 combat missions that he went on before he did bin Laden mission. So that's pretty exciting, because it was like the first week out, it was like number 4 on the New York Times bestseller nonfiction hardcover list. So that was fun. And it was really interesting to write that. And if I say so myself, it's a pretty quick read.
I'll have to check that out. Is that the one that passed away now?
Do you mean the Navy?
The SEAL?
No. He's very much alive.
Didn't a couple of them end up dying?
Not in that raid, no. But SEALs in recent times, there have been a few Navy SEALs who've been killed in action. Yeah, that's been in the news over the past year.
Did he mention why they threw him overboard, or?
Well, I mean, the body was in pretty bad shape after they were done with it. But I think that they didn't want to make it a rallying point for terrorists. So they just wanted it to be over with as quickly as possible. I think that was the idea.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a bunch, Tom.
Sure. Enjoyed talking to you guys.
Yeah, that flew by real fast. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. Take care, buddy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.